I am delighted to introduce our next speaker, whom I think we all know, respect, and admire. A professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and Brigham Women's Hospital, co-founder of the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center, director of the Regulatory Foundation's Ethics and the Law Program at the Harvard Catalyst, director of the Regulatory Policy for Smart IRB. She also serves as on the Secretary's Advisory Committee for the Human Research Protections for HHS, a member of the National Academies of Sciences Committee on Science, Technology, and Law, and she's also serves on the board of directors for Primer. Just to highlight some of her many, many accomplishments, also because I promised her a very brief introduction. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Barbara Bierer.
It's a pleasure to be here. So today I had to cut down my slides from 106 to like 58, and I realized that I'm spending seconds. I'm just going to talk as fast as I can, and know you should all sit back, relax, know that you're going to get the slides, all the references and sites are there, so you can just enjoy this. So I'm going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials and the role of IRB review and oversight, because I think it's something that a lot of people feel is beyond their capacity. It's not, quote, in the regulations, but it is really important to think about. Although I think my institution should agree with everything I say is independent of my institutions. We are supported by grants and contributions, which you can read about, and I have no personal conflicts of interest. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So the MRCT Center is a research and policy center that is dedicated to the conduct, oversight, and ethics regulatory environment of international clinical trials. And we do that work by convening all the stakeholders involved in a problem to try and find, not just define the problem, but come up with solutions, believing that, or attempts at solutions, believing that if everyone agrees to what is possible, it has a much better chance of happening. So what's the importance of diversity? Beyond the fact that participant enrollment should reflect the population affected by the condition or disease under study. Enrollment is always a difficult problem, but getting the right enrollees, quote unquote, in order to reflect the population affected or for whom the intended treatment is intended, I said that twice, can be particularly challenging. It should reflect the population affected by the disease, and the analysis of group differences, however, will be difficult because once one divides the analytic into multiple groups, of course you have to increase the size to get significance. So we can't quite do that. We can't enroll so that we can actually statistically analyze each of the subgroups. So people say, well, why do it at all? Well, there's a social justice reason, there's also a trending reason, and there's also a point about including those people, particularly because they should be part of the research and the data that informs the generalizability of the results. It also reflects fairness in the distribution of direct and long-term benefits of the research. And it's also, as I said, a matter of health equity and justice. Now, my belief is that the importance of making sure that all populations are reflected changes from phase 1 trials to comparative effectiveness research. In the beginning, you probably don't want to include people who cannot consent for themselves, for instance. But by the time you're getting to a phase 3 trial, and certainly after the product or the intervention is approved, one should be looking for populations that reflect the disease or the condition under study. We looked actually at the FDA drug trial snapshots, which actually every year give you a breakdown of the race, ethnicity, and sex of the trials that have been recruited to approve a new molecular entity that year, that past year. And from over 6 years, there were 339 drugs approved. Of all of the trials reported, 21% included less than 1% Asian participants, and 25% included less than 1% participants. That is a huge problem. And of course, it's global data, and there's all sorts of excuses, but the FDA reported the average, which was weighted by enrollment, which was far better than the median, which we recalculated for them. So I'm not saying that it isn't fair data, but we've got a major problem in what we're doing here. So, sorry, go back one if you could. Can't. Yes, can you go back? I don't know how to go back. Thank you. This is, you loaded a PDF, I think. That's going to be a problem. But I'll say anyway, this actually builds through 10 different things that we've done at the MRCT Center to address diversity, inclusion, and equity. We first started working on this in 2015, wrote essentially, the manifesto in 2020 and published it right after George Floyd's murder in order to be able to give people somewhere to start. We then prepared a toolkit which goes through a lot of the different recommendations that we had over 5 years of work. We did a teaching course where we did a seminar series. All of this is available on the web. We did a course for cancer researchers that we then made available to others. We came up with a set of recommendations for health literacy, some of which I'll touch on, equity by design in order to have metrics, IRB and HRPP tools, and finally, recently published accessibility by design for inclusion of patients with disability. We're now working on LGBTQI issues, and then with global DEI and several other things. This would have been more successful had I been able to build the slide, but you get the point. So people say, this isn't the IRB's responsibility, it's scope creep, we can't take this on. I think we all are accountable, and the IRB has a clear role, and the HRPP has a clear role in addressing this. And the regulation should be considered the floor, but justice is the goal. Justice is one of the principles of Belmont. We should rest on a three-legged stool that actually balances. What are the regulatory foundations? In 46.111, criteria 3 is selection of subjects is equitable, which speaks to the fairness and the distribution of the benefits of research. That's in addition to beneficence and justice and respect for persons, which we could think through. And that the IRB shall be sufficiently qualified through the experience and expertise, blah, blah, blah. So we need a qualified and diverse IRB. Those are sort of foundational issues that you can rest on in the regulations. Further, the information that is given to the subject or the LAR shall be in a language understandable to the subject or to the LAR. That's in both OHRP, Common Rule, and FDA. How often do we actually make that language understandable to the participants? So that speaks to health literacy and translation and to access and accessibility. How often do we give people a PDF that you cannot even enlarge or use an assisted device with? We wrote about this a number of years ago and have continued to work on specific actions that people can take at the IRB and HRPP, which I'll be going through. We then took a task force and worked with many of you to develop a sense of what was the role of the IRB, not actually thinking about, is this approvable research, but is this justified research? Is it appropriate research for the population we're studying? And then took the recommendations from the task force and brought them through an independent Delphi, which we just published. Came up with 25 final recommendations on HRPP and IRB responsibilities, IRB review processes that look at initial review and continuing review, communications, translation, and health literacy, and then IRB membership, support, and training. So if one says, you know, we need to start addressing this, one should realize that the IRBs and their institutions set the expectations for the researchers, and really the IRB should be asking questions. If you ask the question, you'll often see people starting to think in a way that's different. You don't have to say anything about what happens to that data or whether you'll approve it or not, but if you ask, how did you involve the community in this, or participants in the development of this protocol? It doesn't say you have to. It just asks whether you did and how did you and what did you do with that information. So, you know, and I think that the IRBs at a minimum should expect a depth of consideration reflected in the trial planning, including participant and community engagement for the design and conduct of the research. And IRBs have an opportunity to monitor progress through periodic review and close out of the studies. How often do we get that information at continuing review or closeout and never say, you're off what you thought you were going to be? What are your plans for correcting the enrollment? It just goes through the process and people sort of say, done, closed out, continuing review, no change in the, but that's our responsibility. And when we consider diversity, there's dimensions of diversity. It's not just race and ethnicity. It's not just age at either edge of the spectrum. It's not just sex. It's gender and gender identity. It's pregnancy, lactation, disability or impairment, social determinants of health, comorbidities, et cetera. And each person is the embodiment of many of those things. There's an intersectionality that's incredibly important for the data that we derive. Only with that data can we understand what we're not right now focusing on. If we never collect the data, we'll never know the answers to some of those questions. So individuals must be invited, you know, and we know from studies that have been done, the Black and non-Hispanic, Black and Hispanics are just as likely to say yes as non-Hispanic white individuals if asked to participate, which means one thing that people are not asked, which means we're not getting to people, we're not accessing people that could participate, or once they get there, they say no. And why do they say no? We don't know, because we don't ask. So thinking about access to knowledge and choice, and making sure that people are given the information to have the choice, not invited. I mean, we did a sort of home study, as it were, no IRB approval, of asking people why they didn't include or invite certain people into their studies. And it was, you know, they have many children at home. It's too far to travel. We can't see them because they'd miss work. That's their choice. And we should be working to resolve those barriers, not the reverse. And if we do that well, we will increase the participants' pool and we will shorten the time course of these studies and get to a faster resolution and knowledge faster. Our IRBs have a historical sort of predilection to protection of the vulnerable rather than equally valuing inclusion of those who are underserved in research and underrepresented in research. And it is time to think about that balance and be thoughtful about who we're excluding and who we're including. So, when we look at benefit risk, we see a, proportional minimized risk and balance of benefit and risk. When participants look at it, they see lots of burden, the privacy that we've just heard about, childcare, travel, trust in the research, which is a commentary from this morning, lost work, uncertainty, discomfort, and then the financial burden of research. Those are all things that we could make headway to correct. But those are the things we need to address. We used to have patients come down for 2.5 hours to get their blood draw for me to say to them, "You're fine, see you in 2 months." Now, we send them locally to get their blood draw. I look at their blood draw, the blood results, and I say, "You're fine, see you in 2 months." Bad for revenue, good for the participants. So, we've divided this into sort of the patient journey, as it were, the participant journey. There are early interventions before they get there in terms of access, recruitment, and screening. Then study conduct from the time that they sign the enrollment, the informed consent, to the end of study, and then the end of study data analysis and reporting. Each of those sections have areas where we could make significant improvements. And that's on top of a foundation where we look at workforce development to try and bring in a workforce that is more reflective of the community, infrastructure, accountability, cultural competencies, and of course, necessary resources. So, each of those have specific ideas about what we can do, and they start with, where do we recruit? Do we know anything about how people get their information in the community? Are we giving it in languages that they can understand? How do we think about that engagement with the community that we heard about so compellingly this morning, which is indeed an institutional responsibility? We don't want all of these individual researchers going into the communities and sort of deciding to helicopter in for their study and withdraw. We need those kinds of commitments that we heard about. So we did, and you will have this sort of larger consideration of the kinds of things that you should be thinking about in the IRB through pre-study considerations, study conduct, and then the post-study conduct, some of which I will go through now. Thankfully, I'm not reading that for you. So there's participant and community engagement. We've heard about that, but thinking about that partnership, input from the community into the study question, which is, more appropriate for some studies than others, the conduct and the communications, and making sure that the community or participants, which are complicated and need to be defined, are persistently engaged and communicated with. The study design and plan, think about the traditional studies that brought everybody to the hospital or to the clinical site. What can we do hybrid? What can we do remotely? And we'll come back to that. But that includes data minimization, which actually is pretty complicated if you're trying to include all the data that we think about. Mobile enablement, such as e-consents, remote monitoring, and geomapping to make sure that we are inclusive. We should be designing the studies for inclusivity so that they're accessible, the health literate, translation where appropriate, increase the eligibility by decreasing the exclusion criteria, recruitment plans that are inclusive and thoughtful about each strategy for different populations, patient navigators where they're there, and payment considerations, which we'll return to. And then they need to be resourced appropriately with digital and data access if you're doing a remote trial. Technology help financial neutrality, which is a huge issue and one that we're continuing to work on, and insurance independent, which is, of course, a problem in the United States. And then there's confidentiality and communications, looking at privacy, confidentiality, security, and connectivity, and the end of study responsibility. Are we taking care of these patients when they end study, or are we actually abandoning them and saying, thank you, your study time is over now? Do we take care to make sure that they have continued access if appropriate, or referral if appropriate? And have we given them back their results so that they know how they contributed to society? So we do have a toolkit, as I mentioned, and it goes through a lot of these specific sort of the theory behind it, and then each of the tools to assist in each of them. They're available for you to use. We have a specific recommendation about eligibility criteria. We have looked at many of the eligibility criteria. People tend to cut and paste eligibility criteria from a prior trial or from other trials. Each of those inclusion or exclusion should be addressed. And if you exclude a population or you state it in a restricted way, that should be defended by either medical, clinical, or ethical reasons. We shouldn't be excluding people because they're, over 65 or on HIV medications, unless there's a reason for it. And when we say male or female, some people are actually excluded from that. When we say, men with prostate cancer, why not just with prostate cancer? So there are many things that we could be doing, and we actually looked at all the eligibility criteria for people in terms of disability, and it is appalling to look at, physician, privilege, basically. It's like, what? That if you don't think a patient will do well, you don't have to bring them into the study. Based on what? So why aren't we saying everyone should be included unless there's a safety, an ethical, a medical reason not to? And again, the FDA has put out really good guidance on this, I think, and people like ASCO have done a really good job of it. And again, the inclusivity changes the more we know about the intervention or product. There's a recruitment strategy where one has to think about how one approaches each of the communities. When we go to the community health center that we work with most closely, there are 10 common languages, and the people in different populations get their information differently, some by church, some by social media, some by so you have to understand that if you want to recruit them. No longer are we advertising on buses. What does that mean? So thinking through that and preparing and helping people to have the resources and the tools to recruit successfully is important. The FDA recently came out with a requirement for FDA-regulated phase 2 and above trials to have a diversity action plan. I hope that NIH considers doing the same. We are moving away from traditional trials, from site-based trials, which are convenient for us, to participant-centric trials, which are based on what can be done locally, what can be done more conveniently, even if it's a little bit harder for the study team. But in so doing, we want to make sure that we equip the populations so that we don't create another excluded population, those that do not have digital access or cannot afford the tools. We should be providing that. We should be covering the data costs and we should be providing access to the technologies as well. It's important to understand that when you're doing these kinds of digital trials, different patients have a different experience. You zoom into somebody's home and you see a very different environment than you do when they come to the office. And many of the people don't have a private place to have a conversation. So setting these interactions up for success requires understanding the person's individual setting. And of course it's more convenient, but it also compromises some of the other issues and creates issues that we should be attending to. And importantly, we should be thinking about clear communications, not just in the informed consent, but in all participant-facing materials. We should be thinking about what we give them in terms of patient instructions, sort of clarity. Not everything has to be in the informed consent. Some things can be beyond informed consent. We should be thinking about whether we want to use written informed consents. Why don't we have graphs and data and videos? Why don't we have tools that people are now quite used to, so that if you press MRI, you get a 30-second visual of what an MRI looks like? We started thinking about this when I first saw Harry Potter and the newspapers were talking to us. I thought, well, this is a great idea. We haven't done any of that. So why don't we start to be a bit creative about how we're communicating? And that means that, we should stop with this low literacy. The participant doesn't have low literacy. We are failing to communicate. The responsibility is on us to communicate in a way that they understand. It's not on them. Their responsibility is to say, I don't understand, and be comfortable asking questions. And it's certainly a greater problem for people whose first language is not English. And we've done a fair amount of work on health literacy. We have a website that will be helpful, we hope, with principles in clinical research, with tools and resources for each of the domains, with a common clinical research glossary for patients or for participants, developed by participants. And in each of those, that's got a plain language definition and an image. We're now recreating all of the images so that they're available for everyone to use, so there's no copyright on them. And it's now a CDISC standard. So, I hope that this will help, so that when a participant reads about randomization, they have a resource to see what randomization is, and that when I use it from the Brigham and Women's Hospital, it's the same as when Johnson & Johnson uses it. And that means we have to think about plain literacy, plain language, numeracy, imagery, visualization, clear design, cultural considerations, and interactive techniques for both written and oral communication, and in a language understandable to the participant. This is an example which was the patient instructions for giving themselves a medication, repurposed to be a more health literate document by Merck. I have to say, none of us would prefer to read the left. So thinking about that as a way, we also are attending to numeracy. This is an example. In 20% or 1 in 5 of patients, tumors got at least 30% smaller. That's one way of presenting the data. Equally important is to say in 80%, or 4 out of 5, tumors did not get at least 30% smaller. There's a nudging in the way that we present the data, which we should be attending to. There are many more examples of that. And we have a training available for IRBs on health literacy, which is applies to recruitment flyers, consents, study instructions, retention materials, et cetera. And there's a 2-page introduction and then a 3-page checklist. And once you do it 2 or 3 times, you get really good at seeing it as well. We also have a course that's available online and for free on health literacy in clinical research. If that's helpful to you or to your study teams, please feel free to take it. And, then we have to think through what it means to say in a language understandable, which both FDA and OHRP say. We did a study of all clinical trials with one US site in 2019 to 2020, scraping clinicaltrials.gov. 20%, 19% of those trials required a person to read, speak, or understand English, or be a native English speaker. We are excluding 1/5 of the population simply because of language, and the same is true in pediatric trials. That means if you were born, elsewhere and not a native speaker, regardless of how well you speak, understand, etc., you're not eligible for a clinical trial. What is that about? Why do we say that's okay? Well, the reasons include things like the tools, the assessment tools aren't validated in other languages. Well, then we should be validating them. It's like the old days where you study 70-kilogram men and you apply it to everything because we'll get to that later. Well, let's just do it. I mean, these are things that we have the capacity to do if we just start doing them and saying this is an expectation. If you're going to do this, you can do it this time, but next time we want to see a validated tool. And there are many tools that are validated. It's not like they don't do studies in Puerto Rico or Spain. So why don't we just reach out to that? And return of individual and aggregate results. We've got people expect their results returned. And 68% of participants will not agree to participate again if they do not see the results of their aggregate, of what they were already in. Why aren't we doing that? Putting together a plain language summary and making it available on a website, on the email that we have, because it's a little bit extra effort. The study is closed. But on the other hand, why not make that an expectation institutionally or through your IRB? Similarly, we have a results form. It's a downloadable, fillable form, and we're developing some imagery so that you can sort of pull down a randomized clinical trial and then fill in what the differences are, et cetera, and more to come on that. The return of individual results, tools and templates, much more complicated than aggregate results. But just for you to know, when you give somebody their aggregate results, they'll say, what arm was I on? And you have to be prepared to say it, to explain that to them. That's okay. So think about the journey for a participant who's just spent all that time investing in your research without having the benefit of their results. So we do have a set of tools about this so that you can contact the healthcare provider, because many of these things are over at that point, an information sheet for participants so that they understand it, an informed consent sample language if you're going to return individual results, and then resources for participants. We do have an IRB and HRPP toolkit specifically. In the IRB resources, it's a membership and self-assessment template. There's a statement of commitment so that you can think about what this means. A statement of commitment to inclusion for the HRPP, approaches to support IRB members to make sure that you're inclusive in your IRB membership, and then health literacy training, as I mentioned. There's the self-evaluation survey. This is just a template. You can adopt it, but understand what your own IRB thinks. What does the staff think? A statement of commitment, which again is, should be at the leadership level, but if there isn't a statement of commitment, then think about whether the HRPP or IRB can make one. And then support for the IRB members so that they have the digital access if you're doing remote consideration, which many of us are, a virtual work environment with accommodations. I think we should be compensating IRB members and certainly community members for their time and effort, and then institutional policy recommendations for that. And then an IRB review checklist so that you can go through and think about what you want to think about for initial and continuing review. There's also an HRPP toolkit, and that includes procedural and logistical considerations, resources for the participant, which you can adapt and then send to the investigators to give, and then work with points to consider on payment for both participants and for the IRB, and some other practical templates. There's the procedural and logistical toolkit checklist, which you'll see, a 2-page guide for participants, which really gives them sort of a guide to what should they understand. This amount of detail need not be in the informed consent, but you should have the material available for people so that they can read it and understand it and understand that, what this means in terms of reimbursement versus compensation for time and burden versus incentive for their tax implications, for instance, something also that we need to address. Costs of injury or harm, and what is the role of insurance and uninsured participants. Then there's points to consider for payment to research participants for the IRB, an overview draft of a protocol template where we took both the Transcelerate template and the NIH FDA in template for phase 2 and 3 trials, and annotated that for inclusivity. We've done the same now for social and behavioral research template that's offered by by NIH, and have posted that. We've done a fair amount of work on accessibility by design to include people with disability, and we sort of divided that into general considerations, communication accessibility, physical accessibility, and then thinking that, people who have decisional impairment are quite different because you need to think about whether or not they're able to sign an informed consent and understand what they're doing. And newer strategies for inclusion, and then accessibility. So how do we hold ourselves accountable? How do we improve? How do we know how we're doing? That's complicated, but one of the things that we should be doing is at least collecting the data. Interestingly, the NIH has this data for each RPPR, but our own institutions, if they have it, don't really collect it, don't really use it, and don't really comment on it. So thinking about just asking the question, you're off your anticipated recruitment goals, what are you planning to do in the next year? Makes people think about that. And industry is way far ahead of academics now. They're really engaged and committed to doing a good job with diversity and inclusion, and are going to start asking each of our institutions for not only how many patients can we contribute, which of course we always overestimate, but also what is the demographic variability of that. And it closed out whether the study has fulfilled its goals. And I have equal sets of recommendations for journals and for sponsors and for institutions, et cetera, because we all have to do this together. We have developed a metrics framework for you to invest some time in understanding with themes, with metrics, both qualitative and quantitative, so that you can measure how you're doing, because what we can measure, we can change, but if we don't measure it, we cannot. And each metrics has levels of detail. So I was challenged the other day to think about, sort of how do we start? We are not very good, we can't do all of this. The IRB is in a position where there isn't a lot necessarily of regulatory support for what you should be thinking about in terms of justice. So I was thinking about that, and I would say I would start with a survey of your IRB membership and see how people feel. See who they think they represent. See what they think about the folks that they're on the committee with. Who's missing? Who's not at the table? And how do we think about reviewing this? And are we doing a good job? I would also get in touch with your leadership. This is not a project that you can do alone. IRBs, if you go at it without the support of leadership, I can promise you investigators and study staff will be complaining. So they'll see it as extra work. We see it as the right work. Make sure you've got leadership behind you. I do think you can start asking the questions both on the protocol and the surround sound of the protocol, all of the pieces that we put in and then upload the protocol itself. Ask those questions. Are you planning to return aggregate results? Have you considered this? What are you doing to, et cetera, et cetera? Just asking the question will help people to start thinking about it and acting differently. And using the data that you receive to see where you need help and where your investigator community needs help. And then providing those resources. We're happy to do that together. These resources are not different, from one group to another. I think it's something we should be developing together and making available. I do think it's important for you to know your community. Where are you? How is this reflected? In Indiana, they say, at one point they said, well, we live in a white community, we can only recruit white people. And I say, first of all, that's not true. And second of all, if it's true, do a multi-site trial. Oh. And we've set up an academic system which rewards individual people for doing those studies. We need to change that so that it's the value of the science, not whether you're first or last author on an underpowered trial, that matters. So I do think getting that together is important. And I stayed up last night to put this slide together because I was asked yesterday and it's not here. But I'll make sure you all have it. But basically, just start. Just start. And if you can just start, you'll start that journey and we'll get there. It's not going to be easy, but we have each other to support everyone. Thank you. Happy to take questions. You have 2 minutes and 13 seconds.
You kind of spoke to towards the end when you comment on multi-site trials, but with the increasing role of, or really the demand to have a single IRB for multi-site studies, do you fear that researchers are going to start using that as a shield? Oh, I can't recruit this population at my institution, but this institution can, so I don't have to do it. Or do you think that's going to foster from an overall level the increased diversity of enrollment because we are utilizing multi-site approaches?
So really good question. So, a trial in aggregate has to reflect the population affected. Each individual study site does not. But if a study site commits, they need to deliver, otherwise everything is off. So that's the way I look at it. I think that, one of the challenges will be frankly, getting the single IRBs comfortable that everybody's asking similar questions and making similar expectations of their sites. And continuing review is going to be very helpful. I don't think every site is going to be diverse, but that is part of why we have a multi-site trial. I think it will make it better. Yeah. We need a mic over here.
Right over where?
This is a very active table. Just let them have the mic.
Hi. I completely agree with your what you were saying about just do it. I wanted to share this because I just realized how I just recently got a National Science Foundation grant. I'm not a researcher, but I realized that we had a problem in research administration with engagement, not just inclusion, but also engagement with actually facilitating conversations and spaces that we are in and ensuring that inclusion occurs. And so I pitched that idea to NSF and I said, it's building research infrastructure networks and knowledge in emerging research institutions. So I just wanted to share, just do it. It's really, really critical that each one of us, we all do different jobs and we are a major linchpin. We are a major linkage in all kinds of organizations. So it's critical that we're equipped to facilitate conversations.
100%. You know, it's interesting. Locally, we have been working with our community to be credentialed translators because our hospital requires translations or interpreters to be certified. So we've been working with them through our CTSA to get them certified, and it's amazing how engaged people become. They just need to feel like they're part of it. And, you know, and on the Delphi, the major concern that people had about making this a strategic priority for IRBs was that we have not trained our you know, sort of frontline staff and everybody that people are going to come in contact with to be respectful and to understand how to communicate and be comfortable if they're going to make a mistake saying, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it to sound that way or whatever. But I totally agree. Getting this, you know, getting people comfortable having tough conversations and getting them engaged is huge. Whoa. This has to get recorded, every word.
It's called appreciative inquiry. And I'm here in Michigan. So actually the grant is to pay research administrators to participate in training in the process of appreciative inquiry.
Congratulations. Last question.
Okay, I have a question. I know you mentioned about sharing of aggregate results. And I guess in my mind, I do think that's valuable, being transparent. But on the other end, I do value the peer review process. And so I kind of worry whether people would share results that aren't necessarily, you know, that would pass muster under peer review. So do you have any recommendations about when or how results should be shared?
So the EU, the EMA has required folks to share aggregate data 1 year after this data lock, and 6 months for pediatric studies. And having that, when you sort of share aggregate data in a plain language way, you are not, it doesn't generally count as a prior publication. And therefore it won't inhibit publication. But I have to say that the 1 year sort of expectation does a good job of focusing the mind to get people to actually submit. And then they should be putting it on bioRxiv or medRxiv so that it's generally available. I'm sympathetic to the idea that it should be peer reviewed, but no participant either wants to read a peer-reviewed journal article to understand it, nor read about their own results in the New York Times or, equivalent of Boston Globe in Michigan, whatever that is. So I'm not as sympathetic to that question. I do think that, I do think clinicaltrials.gov should have a line to say, just as they do, are you planning to data share and where? They should have a line that says where your aggregate results are posted. But, more to come on that. Thank you.